Community conflict is also important to understand. Community conflict typically happens when two parties or two groups, right, within the same society have incompatible goals. Their goals are also in competition with each other, and inevitably what happens is a power struggle, right? So some communities experience a lot of conflict. For example, in the demonstrations of the riots in the 1960s, there was a lot what triggered then in the 1960s where whites clashed with blacks. We can even see today in modern society, we saw that there were, pro-Trump and anti-Trump folks, and there was a lot of clash and rioting that happened across the country as well with those clashes. So many who engage in conflict, they really hope to bring about positive change. A lot of times they think that, hey, I'm here to create conflict. I'm here to rattle the status quo, and I really want to bring about positive change. A positive outcome in community conflict can be social change, and there are some psychologists in community psych and the research they do see and recognize that in actuality, when there is conflict between two groups, a potential positive outcome can be social change, which was seen in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, or even the struggles for equality over gender and sexual orientation issues. The more that you push back against the status quo and make your mark about your needs and demands for equity, really we start to see small changes happening. And so let's move on to the next slide. Now, unfortunately, there are a lot of folks who are dissatisfied with traditional services, and those that are implementing these traditional services are part of the status quo, and they need to know and understand this, right? So if you're dissatisfied with traditional services, then you start to question the status quo, and even the individuals that are in those positions of power and privilege need to sort of look upon themselves as now and question themselves and say, am I doing the right thing? Dissatisfaction with traditional services also causes questioning the effectiveness of traditional services and also questioning the efficiency of those traditional services. Right along here in the field of psychology, we had that experience happen back around the 1950s and 1960s. During early American psychology at the turn of the century, of the 20th century, 1900s on, Freud and psychoanalysis was the dominant framework of psychology. Except Carl Jung and Alfred Adler and others became disenchanted with Freud's approach to therapy, and they modified his psychoanalysis in many, many, many ways. And so they really pushed back against the status quo of American psychology and started to shift it into something very, very different. Even contemporary therapists of the day were very disgruntled and really didn't like sort of Freudian psychodynamic theory. And so from that developed an array of theories that we use today, like behavior modification, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral theory, existential and humanistic counseling. So because there's been dissatisfaction with traditional, psychopathology-based therapies, clinical psychology really led to the creation of not only new approaches to think about therapy, but also led to the creation of community psychology. Same thing. Community psychologists were really concerned about this traditional pathology-based psychology, and it wasn't just about these individual-based clinical interventions. We had to pay attention to the ecological context, to the systems, to society, to communities, to neighborhoods, to know how to really enact change. And it was community psychologists that started to recognize the need for these strength-based, community-oriented interventions, not just individualized clinical therapeutic interventions, but also these community-based interventions as well. So we talked a lot about reasons for change. These are all the reasons for change: diverse populations, declining resources, accountability. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. So when we look at diverse populations, an example of social change where AIDS patients desire emotional support from a group of other AIDS patients. Now, this was happening throughout the 1980s, early to mid-80s, and transitioning into the early 90s. So their families got together to form a support group, and that is one of the most largest support groups and had been one of the largest support groups across the United States. Community conflict, let's take a look at an example of how change occurred from community conflict. An agency was seeking a halfway house in a residential neighborhood not zoned for multiple family dwellings. Two resident groups, one in support and one against, had conflict at a public meeting. Just being open and hearing each other and espousing your point of view is an example of social change. Another area of social change is, we've definitely had community groups, thinking back and forth or pushing back and forth about facial coverings or mask wearing and mask mandates in the United States as well. But nonetheless, it has created changes in behavior and changes in our society as well. There are different types of social change. Sometimes it's spontaneous and unplanned change, and sometimes it's planned change. Spontaneous or unplanned change is unintentional in nature, things like natural disaster and the COVID-19, pandemic, droughts, earthquakes, floods, and fires, anything that tends to displace community members from their homes and their jobs. Although some of these disasters may not be demonstratively distressing, they still tend to cause a shift in change because and there could be stress, but that change happens because it's unknown and uncontrolled. Now, there's also planned social change. Intentional and deliberate actions usually includes people who are change agents, those who are active individuals who are very vocal, who are vocalizing and working for change. Community psychology professionals are trained to help serve agents of change or change agents, to vocalize and to work towards collaborating with others to see a change in their communities. There are issues of planned change. There's a lot going on here. And I know there's a whole section in your book that you can read about that. But I wanted to point out a few things. Now, issues of planned change. Now, we need to, again, collaborate with participants in the community, especially if you're part of a leadership or you're part of an institution or you're part of a larger system. Then you know that you're going to make change to certain practices that can affect community members. Then you need to prepare your participants for change. You need to collaborate. You need to connect. You need to get, involved with the community. There's also patience for change is required as well. Unfortunately, change is very, very slow. Sometimes it has to do with funding. Sometimes it has to do with bureaucracy. And sometimes it has to do with other people pushing back against the change and trying to set up roadblocks and obstacles and don't want it to change. The social climate of a community has to be ready for change as well. There has to be people who are disenfranchised and maybe even dissatisfied with what's happening in their community. Another issue of planned change, again, this is not that unintentional, this is the intentional change, is that change must be innovative. It has to be new. It has to be stepping outside the box. Can't just hold on to those old assumptions and plans that are already in existence and making modifications of them. You've got to make these grander, innovative changes for real, to have a real effect and a real change on other people. Now, we know even though there's all these issues of planned change, we do know that leadership really needs to be supportive. Leadership is important, and collaboration is a hallmark of this type of community work. The issues of planned change doesn't have to be as multitude like as we see it here, right? It doesn't have to be as so multiplied as we have it here. Because if we're collaborating and leaders are supportive and really involving others to be a part of the decision making and collaborating through problem solving, then you're going to reduce the amount of issues that come along with planned change. Let's talk a little bit more about the difficulties. Let me switch the slides here. More difficulties to bring about change. Well, we know change can be unwelcome. Not everybody wants change. Not everybody likes change, right? So some people are resistant to change, particularly from those who would benefit from it because they have been socialized to think that change is not possible. They want to maintain the status quo. In other words, the in-group has certain advantages, right? So they don't want anything to change. Maybe they're, getting profit, so they're going to resist government interference. Out-group stereotyping and stigma, right? This produces resistance to even wanting to help them. If we look at others and say, oh, well, we can't help them because they have and they are all these different stereotypes and isms that come along with it, then people don't want to collaborate and connect and are resistant to helping for change. For change to take shape, we have to have conscientization. This was done by Pablo Freire, and he says we need to bring awareness of oppression to the oppressed, that many times people who are oppressed and marginalized don't even know not only that they're being oppressed, but the impact and the effect that it is having on them, their family members, and even previous generations and future generations. Other difficulties that it's hard to bring about change are personal traits and individual factors that kind of just exist within human nature. Sometimes we can be cognitive misers. Not that we're lazy thinkers to the point that we don't have the intellectual capability, but our brains work on something called heuristics, right? Heuristics are these mental shortcuts. The brain sort of sometimes looks for the easiest way to strategize and come up with a solution. It doesn't always want to do the hard work. So sometimes we are cognitive misers because we need to save our resources, our cognitive resources, for all the things we have to manage. And through that sensory and perceptual information we're dealing with on a daily basis, we can kind of tend to sort of want to reserve our cognitive resources and focus on those heuristics. Then dogmatist, or being dogmatic, is also being closed-minded, right? And so if we're closed-minded, then people, those can just be reasons why we're not going to see effective change either. Interestingly enough, there are methods of change and rules for radicals. So radical methods of change, right? If the status quo is really pushing back, or you feel like you can't make any progress, Alinsky says, you can use the existing rules to bring about pressure on the status quo. And if you start to looking at some of these points here, they're rules of 1 to 10. When you first think about it, you're like, radical methods. But when you look at them again, you're like, oh yeah, you're right. These are the tactics that the status quo already uses, right? Get attention. They already have the attention. They own the attention. Well, guess what? Those that are oppressed and that are looking for change, it's your turn to regain that attention back. We could go to, make the foe obey their own rules. They've created the rules. They've established the rules. So enforce the rules. Support that the rules get enforced. Let's see. A threat is more terrifying than the action. That also needs to be recognized. And again, we've seen this happen. When we looked at our first slide, right, for the last 400 years, since the early 1600s, when we saw the first enslaved person brought to the Americas, power and tactics and threats to terrify people has been an action that we've seen induce. So even though these are looking at radical methods of change, they really are, according to Alinsky, use the existing rules that the status quo already uses to kind of flip the script a bit, push it back on them to apply pressure to the status quo. You basically, on these 10, are using their own tactics against them. Now, Alinsky did note that no power change ever occurred without some struggle. And so power struggles are going to happen. But if you use the existing rules that the status quo uses, then that can bring about pressure on that group and enforce them to sort of start having conversations about making change. We've already talked about some of the difficulties in change here, but I wanted to focus on a couple of things here: in-group, out-group, and empathic linkages. Empathic linkages is really, we just need to build empathy. We need to have a society and a community and neighbors where there's more empathy, right? So we need especially to have empathy towards those that are negatively affected by existing systems. Now, when it comes to in-group, out-group, let's take a look at that on another slide. For in-group, out-group, we have these us versus them mentality. The in-group says it's a group that one belongs to and identifies with, sees it as us, but they also have this in-group bias. The in-group bias says, look at how amazing we are so much better than them. And within the out-group, this is how they perceive it, a group that one does not belong to or identify with, again, they are the out-group, they are them, and they're seen as out-group homogeneity. Out-group homogeneity tells us, look at them, they're all the same, there isn't anything unique or interesting about them, right? And in the in-group, that in-group bias says, we are such an amazing, wonderful, unique bunch of people, and that's why we're so fascinating and interesting. Well, guess what? Your out-group within their system is saying the same thing about your group as well. So this us versus them mentality really doesn't help any collaboration efforts to really build and move forward in society to make change. Finally, capacity building, right? Capacity building is the effort to increase organizational strengths and abilities, which in the end empower communities to do more and to do better. And this is one of the goals of community psychology, capacity building. Again, increasing strengths and abilities, empowering communities. Again, you should be cautious. You can't take an oversimplistic approach. Remember at the very beginning of the chapter, when we really see these second and third order levels of change, it's because you've stepped outside of the status quo and the existing systems, and you've become innovative and really thought in multiple layers and looked at a holistic ways and really shifting and changing culture and belief systems and ideology, right? Because, change is difficult. It's not simplistic. There's multiple levels that have to be involved. It's multi-layered, and we have to look at the whole picture. And that's it. That ends our video lecture for this chapter on social change.